Hey everyone, and welcome to the Sunny Go One Piece podcast. On this episode, we're going to be diving into episodes 775 through 777, which will cover manga chapters 819 through 823. And we see as Luffy sets off for Whole Cake Island, we also get to catch up with some past friends and see them get ready for a journey of their own. Alright, so synopsis. With Zunisha's injuries treated, Luffy, Nami, Chopper, and Brook, along with Pedro and Pecoms, set out for Whole Cake Island to retrieve Sanji and get the road poneglyph rubbing. Meanwhile, all over the world, many of our past friends are preparing for a journey of their own to the Reverie. Alright, so let's get into the differences. So there aren't a lot of like individual changes. However, the few that there are, they're pretty big. So most of episode 775 is added filler. All the scenes of the Alliance coming together to repair the island and to save Zunisha is all added. In the manga, chapter 822, it immediately begins with Chopper and Miyagi already having just finished treating Zunisha's leg. Everything in the episode leading up to this point is all filler. In fact, you can pretty much skip most of episode 775 altogether because episode 776 pretty much begins exactly as chapter 822 begins when you include like the recap and everything. So you can largely skip 775 if you really just want to get through it. Episode 777 is largely filler as well, as they take the time to have Vivi remember her time with the Straw Hats and do a mini recap of the Arabasta arc with updated animations and voice acting, which is kind of cool to see. The anime skips a couple updates of other familiar countries' rulers preparing for their journey to the Reverie as well. And we'll see these in the next episode. But these were shown just after the introduction of the Reverie. And then we got to see all those random kingdom rulers arrive at Marijois. But it's sandwiched in between where the Fishman Island family gets seen. So with all the stuff with Shirahoshi and stuff. So it's kind of in between those two. But then I think for time, it was moved to next episode. So those are all the differences. So let's get into the episodes themselves. And these episodes begins with everyone banding together to help preparations to treat Zunisha's leg, while the Whole Cake Island team prepares for their journey as Nami acquires an old map of Whole Cake Island and Luffy gets food, which is very fitting for both of them. Although because this is completely filler, the map or this knowledge really plays no factor into the future at any point. In that moment where Zoro is sent to chop some lumber to repair the gondola ships, was pretty funny though. I did enjoy this, as he and Law have this sort of conversation about Zoro's insane lack of direction, and instead Law just shambles him back to the work area, fearing he would get lost again. Which I kind of like this pairing. It's pretty funny. Ever since they arrived on Zou with the whole Ryunosuke thing, like they're just kind of on a very similar wavelength. Both very stoic, emotionless swordsmen. But yeah, it is kind of funny to see them. There's not really too much to discuss about this episode, as it's for the most part not canon and just mostly scenes of actions that could have been off screen, which is how it is in the manga, because it's all stuff we know about the Minks and the Straw Hats and just kind of rehashes it while they work together. However, this episode and also the next several chapters is probably where the idea of sort of Carrot potentially becoming the next Straw Hat crew member came into the fans' consciousness for sure. I don't know why, but when you watch the fillers particularly, they really try and play this up. And so, yeah, you're left wondering, will Carrot actually join the crew or not? And it is kind of a fun mystery that plays out for most of this entire saga, really. And you don't really figure out whether she does or doesn't join until much, much later. But that'll be something we'll want to discuss later. Anyways, we start seeing Carrot take a bit more center stage among the Minks, and she even asks Luffy to join them on their adventure to Whole Cake Island. And I'll admit, I even started to think, could this be another potential Straw Hat around this time? Like, I wasn't quite convinced at that moment yet, though, because she was still missing a lot of the checkboxes that a Straw Hat needed, like a tragic backstory with a flashback and a dream. Now, that's not to say that she can't get those, because, I mean, Robin started off as a crew member, and we only really had her dream, but we didn't quite know what her tragic backstory was, although we could have inferred that she had one based on the life she's lived so far by the point that she joined after the Arabasta saga. But yeah, it is an interesting thing. But having a mink and another female crew member would be great to balance out the crew dynamic too. And I feel like the anime really added a lot of fuel to the idea of Carrot being the potential next Straw Hat with this episode, whereas Oda in the manga was a bit more subtle about it. He definitely laid some clues out, but it's not quite as in your face as the anime does. And this whole section would be a really unique time for One Piece in terms of crew members, because Oda seems to have been very hesitant in adding new crew members since Brook, really. Even Jinbei, who is technically a member that joined after the time skip, still has not actually joined them. So really, it's just still the original 9 from the Paradise side of the Grand Line. There's of course a real world and logistical reason for this, and that's that it's hard to write for such a large ensemble cast and give them all the proper screen time and development and moments for them to shine when his story arcs are already massive in scale and only getting larger. In fact, that is why you're beginning to see Oda split the crew up completely, not just split them up into groups within the arc to do their own things, but completely write them out of the arc so that he can focus on a more condensed group of characters. And that's what you saw on Dressrosa when the crew was split in half. And now going into the next major arc, we again see the other half of the crew, so it's split again for Whole Cake Island to face Big Mom. On the one hand, I think that it is cool that we get more focused attention on specific characters that we haven't gotten to see since the early part of the series. But one of the biggest appeals for me when it comes to the series is seeing the entire crew together and working as a unit, and because that's always really cool to see. So it sucks not seeing them together, but that is where Oda is being smart about his power scaling, like he was in the beginning of the series. Like, one of the common criticisms of many shonen battle anime/manga series is that power-ups and boosts in combat seemingly come out of nowhere sometimes, or at very convenient times. But Oda has always been really careful about this by introducing antagonists that are already stupid strong so that we don't have an escalation issue. But when it comes to the Straw Hats, their boosts seem more reasonable because Oda has written it so that they're already pretty strong, but finds ways to nerf the Straw Hats or put them in situations where their strength isn't what's needed. But some other skill set is actually what gets them through those, crises. Going back to my point about all this is that by splitting the crew up, and especially the monster trio, it allows Oda to keep the antagonists a bit more reasonable in terms of power without having to go overboard with escalation until he needs the crew to come together. So when you're thinking, if the entire crew were together, that they could easily take this out, or solve this problem, that's the point, which I think is pretty cool that Oda is kind of being smart about that. Because if he were to keep them all together, he'd have to create an even more powerful enemy before they even get to, folks like Big Mom and Kaido. Anyways, moving back to the story, Chopper, with the help of Miyagi and everyone else, is able to patch Zunisha's leg back up, although the anime makes it a whole ordeal whereas the manga is just a difficult task based on Zunisha's sheer size, but the anime needs to contend with crazy storm weather and everything. And Miyagi tells us that Zunisha is at least 1,000 years old, which means that he was around before the Void Century and during the time of the Ancient Kingdom. And there's a great deal of mystery surrounding Zunisha, but one thing that many people's mind went to was the fact that Zunisha, or his race of these giant, animals or elephants, were, potentially those massive monsters we saw in the fog at the end of Thriller Bark. Since so far, he's the only thing that even comes close to their size. And I personally have my doubts as to whether that's the case, since it almost seems like Zunisha is one-of-a-kind being, and it just doesn't seem like the type of, being to just start attacking ships out of nowhere, even though we just saw Zunisha is very much capable of it. But the Legend of the Florian Triangle says that many ships disappeared in that, and so I find it really strange that Zunisha would just start attacking things randomly. I think the thing that I always get hung up on is the fact that only Momonosuke can communicate with him, as it was mentioned earlier that Roger and Oden could also hear him, but even his own father, Oden, could not actually communicate with Zunisha, just like Luffy couldn't. The similarities between Momo's connection with Zunisha and Shirahoshi's connection with the Sea Kings is pretty hard to ignore. Even with the information I have today, it's kind of still hard to nail down what Zunisha is and what purpose he will serve the greater story. Although there is a ton of wild theories out there, so if you're interested in those, you can certainly find them on YouTube or Reddit, because there are some wild theories out there when it comes to Zunisha and what he is, who he is, and what purpose he served. But Momo himself is also very interested in Zunisha and his connection to him, as he requests Kinemon to remain on Zou to see if he can communicate once again and see if he can tell anything about his family's connection to Zunisha. And with that, it is decided that he will remain, and Inuarashi will remain to also protect him and bring him safely to Wano when it is time, while Kinemon and the others return to Wano to prepare for the impending war back home. Of course, Luffy and his group will go to Whole Cake Island to get Sanji and the road poneglyph rubbing, while Nekomamushi sets out to find Marco and recruit him for the ensuing war as well. A little bit later on, we get a scene with Pedro requesting Nekomamushi to accompany Luffy to Whole Cake Island as a way to repay some of their debt for them, saving their entire lives and their home. Then we get a string of, at first, very reasonable reasons for others wanting to also join to help repay the Straw Hats, to then devolving into more and more arbitrary reasons, ending with the canine minks just wanting more Brooks bones. Ultimately, Nekomamushi makes the decision that Pedro will be the lone mink representative to accompany the Straw Hats, seeing as how he is the only one that can keep Peckham's in check, which is very interesting why he would even need to be kept in check. And I guess there is a worry that his true alliances still lie with Big Mom, which is understandably so, and could cause some trouble with the Straw Hats, which Pedro could be sort of an intermediary somehow. Regardless, it's looking like Pedro will develop into more of a prominent character than we thought. And of course, then the Pedro for Straw Hat campaign also began, although not nearly as fervently as the Carrot one. Again, I thought it would be cool to have a mink as part of the crew. I never felt like these two would be it, at least as of that point, because they just weren't developed enough. But seeing as how Pedro is at least going with them, he might get that development, just like I mentioned with Carrot. So there is still plenty of opportunity with both of them in terms of joining the crew. One little fun scene and a bit of world building is that with them all splitting up, they want to be able to communicate. So Kinemon wants to see if they can get some Dendemushis, but can't seem to recall what they're called, which highlights one of the core issues with being an isolationist country like Wano. They don't get the technological advancements from the outside world because obviously trade and travel is so restricted that no one brings those new ideas in. But it's fun that wild Dendemushis were found by Robin earlier and that Frankie can just whip them up really quickly, which is, I thought, a really fun detail because we don't really get to see that side of the world building. And I like this small scene that kind of told us a little about Wano and the Straw Hats, because a lot of this information I feel like is only reserved for SBS responses, and so we don't get much information about the Dendemushis or anything outside of the main story. We then cut back to Luffy going to retrieve Peckham's, only to find that the house he was recovering in was demolished due to the attack, and freaks out. But luckily, again, due to Peckham's turtle devil fruit, he was able to survive. And he mentions that his diamond hard turtle shell is incredibly handy, and it certainly is. And I love this unhinged conversation between Peckham's and Luffy, where he starts to call him Kamemamushi, and then which means turtle viper. And then Peckham's just responds, "So I guess you're now just dropping the Pecco part of my name altogether." I also absolutely love how Luffy decides to transport Peckham's around by strapping him to his back. And then later on, when they're getting ready to leave, it's the same deal, but Luffy has this massive backpack full of food. And over that, he has Peckham strapped behind him. And it just looks crazier when he takes it to that extent. And I love that Oda puts this gag front and center on the cover of volume 82. And I chuckle every time I look at this volume cover because it's so funny. Just seeing Peckham's just struggling because he's just strapped to Luffy's back. Back with the others, we get a very cool moment where Nami gets her next power-up or buff, as Usopp has developed her a new climb attack, or rather an upgraded version of her current sorcery climb attack called the Grow Up, and that Usopp has infused his pop greens into that allows it to shrink and grow. And all the tech that she brought along from Witheria is also incorporated in there as well, while being reinforced with Frankie's new build quality. Nami is more and more becoming basically the mage of the crew. The interesting thing is, design-wise, Oda decided to move away from sort of that cyan blue metallic color of all the past climb attacks, and basically had Usopp color it with Nami's colors of orange and white. The extending bow staff of the sorcery climb attack is something I think they took inspiration from for the live action, for how they would practically create Nami's bow staff, as instead of operating it as like segmented pieces where she snaps them together like she does in the manga during the East Blue and pretty much every time until she gets her climb attack in Arabasta. And I like that she uses the extending bow staff. It's pretty cool in both the anime here and in the live action. I also love the usual tropes of when Usopp introduces a new climb attack to Nami. She starts using it without reading or following any of Usopp's instructions, and she just completely blows past his R&D fees as well and doesn't pay him for anything. And these two paired with each other is always really great to see. The two weakest members are always supporting each other, and that's why I'm always fine with the fact that neither of them become that strong relative to the story. But, with this sort of, I feel like Nami could take another step up because, yeah, she has some legitimate strengths and things that no one can do. With all the preparations completed, it's now time to set off for Whole Cake Island, and while Kanjuro offers to draw them a new animal to help them down, Luffy just casually declines and then proceeds to bear hug everyone and jump off like he's done in so many other situations. But this jump feels very reminiscent of Skypiea, even though in Skypiea Luffy never actually jumped off himself, but it does feel very reminiscent of the end when they all just like plummet back down to Earth. And my favorite little detail of this scene is easily Law, because in that wide shot of everyone shocked and freaked out that Luffy has just taken everyone and jumped like 3 miles down. But if you carefully look at Law, he's just annoyed because he expected something like this. Like, you can see him like, oh god. It's pretty funny when you see like the like 20 to 25 characters all like just absolutely dumbfounded, and then you see Law's face. He's just like, ah. It's pretty funny. However, this isn't the moment episode 776 ends, as we get to see some people we haven't seen in the anime in a very long time, and that is the royal family of Arabasta. Vivi, along with Karu, as well as King Cobra, accompanied by Igaram, Chaka, and Pell, are all preparing to set out to sea on their way to Marijois for the Reverie. And in the next episode, we also get to see Koza and Toto seeing them off as well. And they are being escorted by Rear Admiral Hina, as well as her faithful companions Django and Full Body. Now, Rear Admiral is a new rank that we haven't really seen. This is a rank just below Vice Admiral. Now, if you've been keeping up with the cover stories, you know that all of these people have been busy with their own small adventures. But in the story, all we've seen is a few times of them reacting to the Straw Hats' bounties going up each time after every major arc. And this is, of course, a special moment for Vivi as she gets to set sail out to sea for the first time in 2 years since her adventures with the Straw Hats. And I personally love this because, as you know, I am a big proponent of considering Vivi an official Straw Hat crew member, and I'm very much eagerly waiting her eventual reunion at some point, because we know it's going to happen. And so I think it's probably going to happen near the end of the story, which is my guess. And I feel like this is kind of sort of that first step, her getting out to sea for the first time in years and wondering to herself if she will get to see them again. And I think she will. The anime goes into a long recap of the events of the Arabasta arc, particularly during sort of the climax of the third act. But when we do get to the story again, it's revealed that Cobra has been afflicted with some illness, as he is seen laboriously coughing and wheelchair bound, with Chaka even saying that if this journey is too much, that they'll turn the ship around. But Cobra is dead serious, no, pun intended, on his intent to attend this year's Reverie to investigate the meaning behind the poneglyphs and what his family, the Nefertari family, has, their role in the part of this story. This was another huge development as we just learned more about the poneglyphs on Zou. We now might get some more insight into how Arabasta and the Nefertari family is involved with this as well, as they were clearly protectors of a poneglyph, same as the Minks on Zou. And there were a lot of thoughts by many, including myself, that they might have even been allies with the ancient kingdom. One aspect about this scene that I don't really like that they omitted from this moment in the anime is that despite littering the last several episodes with these long-winded recaps, Toei decided to leave out the one recap that Oda actually felt needed to be included in the and so they left it out in the anime. So the moment is when Cobra mentions that there are some questions he needs answered from the world government. In the manga, he actually remembers the scene where Robin tearfully gives up on her dreams down in the catacombs and says to Cobra, "My dreams have too many obstacles." And I find it annoying because they chose to omit the one recap that was included in the manga, but also because it's one of my favorite scenes. Also, if you cast your memory back to that scene, we can get a sense of what Cobra might want to ask the world government. Because in that scene, we saw him learn of the real poneglyphs and what information they contain, and he's startled to learn that with these, that they can learn about the history that was erased, aka the Void Century. And most curious of all, he begins another sentence with, "Then why do we," and then gets cut off by Luffy picking him and Robin up to carry them to safety out of the collapsing catacombs. My thought is that at that moment, he came to a partial realization and wants to know why his family has been tasked with protecting the poneglyphs. If this is something that goes in direct opposition to the world government, which is what he wants to understand by confronting them. Although asking the world government about the poneglyphs is most certainly a death sentence, which is probably why he's choosing now to do so, considering he is already nearing death due to his illness. And although even with this dire seeming illness, it's great to see that positive and playful side of Cobra as he uses his illness to playfully guilt Vivi into putting more serious effort into finding a husband. But as we can see, Vivi is still all about adventuring, and she's only 18 years old at this point. We can't forget that. But as we see her leap off the crow's nest and land gracefully on her feet, showing that she still is keeping in shape, and maybe even receiving some training from Chaka and Pell, or maybe even Koza. In any case, it will be very interesting to see how Vivi and the folks from Arabasta get folded back into the story, because we all know they're going to be a significant part of filling in the gaps of the past. Before continuing with the story, I kind of want to mention that you may have noticed that Cobra's voice is different. And I actually didn't know this, but so Iemasu Kayumi was the original voice of Nefertari Cobra during the Arabasta arc. And then with his reappearance in episode 522, after the events of Marineford, we saw Cobra again, but he was played by Toshiya Ueda because Iemasu Kayumi passed away. Rest in peace. But then Ueda only played Cobra for that one episode, 522. And then now, in his reappearance here, Cobra is voiced by a new actor, Hozumi Goda. So, yeah, he's now had 3 voice actors. It is interesting that the voices are all very distinctly different, if you've listened to them. I do prefer the original, Iemasu Kayumi. He had like a very, a very powerful yet regal voice, whereas this one, I guess it makes sense because Cobra is sick, so his voice just doesn't seem as commanding, which is interesting. But yeah, I don't really hate it or anything. It's just I just like the first one more. So I kind of wanted to mention that because unfortunately, both Iemasu and Toshiya both passed away. So rest in peace to both of them, and thanks for lending their voices to such an amazing character. Moving on from the Arabasta folks, with another blast from the past, we are taken back to Loketown as we see a couple nobles from the Goa Kingdom who are revealed to be the queen of the Goa Kingdom, Sally Antoinette, and her husband, a familiar name who is now the king, Stelly. That rotten little brat that took Sabo's place and it looks like Sabo's parents got their way as Stelly seemingly became the king of the Goa Kingdom, is no doubt on his way to Reverie as well as the representative of the Goa Kingdom. He's still just as trash as he was as a kid. So, a bit of translation note here with Sally, whose name is obviously a reference to Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, and the wife of King Louis the 14th, or no, the 16th, the last king before the fall of the monarchy with the French Revolution, which kind of foreshadows what's in store for Stelly and Sally, and pretty much the corrupt nobility in all of One Piece. But my favorite part about this is that in Japanese, her name is Sally Nantoka Natte. So nantoka is the Japanese word for something, as in when you can't remember something, you're just like something, whatever. And so you say in Japanese it's like nantoka whatever. And according to the SBS from volume 84, Oda said that he named her this because he was lazy and wanted her name something that references Antoinette, but was too lazy to come up with anything clever. So he just basically named her Nantoka Net or something Net, to kind of get that Antoinette part of it, which I think is hysterical that Oda even has like moments where he's just like, whatever. Also, can we take a minute to appreciate how one of their aides has an apartment building for a chin? Like, this guy literally, his chin is a building with windows and a door. I don't understand what this is in reference to or what Oda was on when he created this character, but there's literally no information on this character, I feel like. But it's really funny to see. Anyways, we get to see many rulers from various nations that we aren't familiar with, but we do get to catch up with others, starting with the Fishman Island, as the ministers of the right and left are trying to convince Shirahoshi to join them to the surface for the Reverie, but she's too scared to go without Luffy's promised escort. But Fukaboshi finally convinces her with the bravery that she learned from her time with the Straw Hats, as well as honoring their mother, Otohime's dream and her bravery when she went up there. But before this set of episodes wraps up, we catch back up with the Straw Hats as everyone aside from Luffy is reeling from the fact that they just finished plunging 3 miles vertical, like a free fall. I love the little touch of how when Luffy is scowling at his crew that they're of their lack of spirit, he copies Peckham's trademark "Gow." But just then, one person does show some life and bursts onto the deck, and to everyone's shock, it's Carrot. She has stowed away on the Sunny and has snuck her way on this mission. This, of course, fuels the Carrot for Straw Hats theorists and advocates quite heavily now that she's actually there. Carrot's inclusion and more will be a topic of the next podcast, so look forward to that. But that's where we will conclude this episode. But yeah, if you did enjoy this, send me a like or comment because it really helps and I like it. And if you want to join me on this journey of rewatching One Piece, please consider subscribing on whatever streaming or podcast platform you are listening or watching on this. And check out my Instagram at SunnyGo Podcast for updates when I post new episodes and to see pictures of my manga collection. As always, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to listen to my podcast. No spoiler section today. Stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Bye!